The afternoon was calm, the kind of quiet that settles over small towns when the sun hangs high and the streets are half empty. Colonel James Carter drove slowly down Main Street, his sedan polished, his posture straight behind the wheel. To him, driving was never just movement. It was a ritual of patience, of discipline. He had lived through convoys under fire overseas. No suburban traffic could rattle him. But flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror still brought a twist to his stomach. James pulled over smoothly, easing the car to the curb. His record was spotless, his registration in order. He knew he hadn't run a light or exceeded the limit. Still, he cut the engine, placed both hands calmly on the steering wheel, and waited. The officer approached with a swagger that spoke louder than his uniform. Officer Rick Walters, broad shoulders, mirrored sunglasses, the kind of man who seemed to enjoy the weight of his badge more than the responsibility it carried. "Afternoon," Walters drawled, leaning down toward the window. "Mind telling me what you're doing driving through here?" James turned his head slowly. His voice was deep but even. "Driving home, officer." From the grocery store, Walters smirked, glancing at the paper bag in the passenger seat. "Sure. You don't really look like you belong around here. License and ID." There it was, the wordless accusation. Don't belong. James had heard it in airports, in boardrooms, even in classrooms when he visited schools to speak about service. But here it carried the weight of flashing lights and a hand resting near a holstered weapon. He moved carefully, deliberately. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my jacket pocket." "Go ahead," Walter said, though his posture stiffened as if expecting trouble. James handed over his driver's license and, alongside it, his veteran's identification card. He didn't speak, didn't explain. The card spoke for itself, a lifetime of service condensed into plastic and print. Walters glanced at it, then chuckled. "Veteran's ID, huh? Cute. Doesn't mean anything here?" He flicked the card with his finger like a toy he was unimpressed with. "This isn't the army, old man. This is my town." From the corner of his eye, James saw movement. A couple walking their dog had paused on the sidewalk. Another man leaned against a storefront, phone in hand. The small-town quiet was shifting, filling with eyes, with witnesses. James kept his gaze steady, his voice calm. "Officer, that ID means more than you understand. It's not just a card." But Walters only smirked wider, as if the challenge fed him. "We'll see about that." Officer Walters held James's veteran ID between two fingers, squinting at it as though it were some cheap novelty card handed out at a gas station. His smirk widened into a full laugh, loud, sharp, designed for the growing audience on the sidewalk. "Look at this," Walters said, holding the card up for the bystanders as if it were a joke worth sharing. "Colonel Carter, huh? Sure you are. Bet you got this thing online. One of those mail-order military cards. Real impressive." A few in the crowd frowned uneasy. Others just pulled out their phones, the red recording lights glowing. The dog walker whispered to her husband, "That man looks serious." "That's not fake." James didn't flinch. He sat with his hands still on the steering wheel, his profile calm against the glare of the afternoon sun. His silence only seemed to irritate Walters more. "You think this little piece of plastic makes you somebody?" Walters sneered, tapping the ID against the roof of the car. "Out here, you're just another driver I pulled over. And if I say you're suspicious, then you're suspicious." James turned his head, his eyes locking on the mirrored lenses. His voice was level, deliberate. "I earned that card. Every line, every letter, every rank letter. Don't dismiss what you don't understand." Walters barked a laugh, stepping back theatrically. "Oh, we've got ourselves a tough guy." "What, you gonna give me orders now, Colonel?" He made air quotes with his fingers. The crowd stirred uneasily. One young man muttered, "That cop's digging himself a hole." Another lifted his phone higher, capturing every sneer, every insult. James exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling with a patience forged over decades. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "Son, I don't have to give you orders, but you ought to take a closer look before you embarrass yourself." Walter's smirk twitched, but he shook his head dismissively. Embarrass myself? Number. You're the one sitting here pretending to be something you're not. And I don't care what stories you've got. You don't outrank me on this street. The words hung in the air, brittle and dangerous. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, their silence now heavy with anticipation. James shifted slightly, his gaze unbroken. Is that so? He asked quietly. Because in his wallet, waiting, was proof far heavier than plastic. And soon, everyone, including Officer Walters, would see it. The air on Main Street had shifted. What began as an ordinary traffic stop now felt like a stage, the crowd swelling at the edges, drawn by the tension. Some held up phones, others simply folded their arms, waiting to see what would happen next. Colonel James Carter sat behind the wheel, his profile calm, his hands still steady on the steering wheel. To anyone else, the scene might have looked one-sided. A cop looming, badge gleaming, voice sharp with authority. But those who looked closely saw something else. James wasn't shrinking. He wasn't rattled. He was anchored, like a man who had weathered far worse storms. Out of the car, Walters barked suddenly, tapping the glass with the ID. If you're really who you say you are, let's take a closer look. Unless you're scared, James moved deliberately, opening the door with measured calm. He rose to his full height, taller than the officer by several inches. Age had silvered his temples, but his shoulders were squared, his posture unbroken. The kind of stance that made soldiers snap to attention. Scared? James repeated quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a deep resonance that silenced the murmurs in the crowd. I've walked into fire. I've buried brothers who gave everything. Fear doesn't live here anymore. The words were simple, but they struck harder than any shout. Walters chuckled nervously, though sweat glistened at his temple. Big talk. Doesn't change the fact that around here, I'm the authority. You think that card makes you special? James's gaze didn't waver. That card represents decades of service. Years of decisions where the lives of thousands rested in my hands. You think a badge in a small-town street make you bigger than that? The officer faltered, caught between arrogance and doubt. The crowd murmured louder, shifting toward James. Man's got a point, someone whispered. He looks the part, another said. James reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately. You're mocking what you don't understand, he said, his voice still steady. So I'll show you. Walters stiffened, his hand twitching near his holster. But James moved with the calm precision of a man who had lived by rules of discipline all his life. From his wallet, he withdrew a leather case, worn but polished. The crowd leaned in, eyes wide. Because in that case lay more than a card. It held the truth. And the truth carried stars. The street was silent except for the hum of a car engine idling and the steady rush of the river beyond the town. All eyes were locked on James Carter as he opened the leather case in his hand. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though the act itself carried weight. Inside was his military identification, but more than that, it was the insignia, stitched in deep gold against dark fabric, that caught the light. 3 stars, Lieutenant General. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman clasped her hand over her mouth. Someone whispered, 3 stars. That's the real deal. A teenager filming muttered, Man outranks half the state. Officer Walters froze. His smirk evaporated in an instant, replaced with something far less certain. His mirrored sunglasses couldn't hide the sudden flicker of fear in his eyes. He leaned forward, staring at the stars, as if hoping they'd disappear. But they didn't. They glimmered under the daylight, unshakable proof. James's voice was calm, steady as stone. You laughed at that card. You called it worthless. But these stars aren't jokes. They were earned in deserts and jungles and war rooms and on battlefields. While you were writing tickets, I was commanding men and women who would have laid down their lives without hesitation. The words weren't spoken with anger. They were spoken with dignity, a dignity that filled the air heavier than any shout could. Walters swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. His hand, which had hovered so close to his holster minutes ago, now hung useless at his side. The weight of what stood before him pressed down like gravity itself. James took a step closer, his height and presence undeniable. You mocked me. You mocked service you'll never understand. But the truth, officer, is simple. You don't outrank me. Not in experience, not in responsibility, not even here. The crowd erupted. Some clapped, others cheered, and phones caught every second. Walter's ears flushed red, his authority shrinking under the stares of his own neighbors. And for the first time that day, the laugh belonged to no one. Not Karen. Not Walters. Only the silence of a man who realized he had picked the wrong target, a man who had just been outranked by 3 stars. Officer Walters stood frozen, the laugh that had once bounced off storefront windows now stuck in his throat. The crowd pressed closer, no longer on his side. Dozens of eyes and phones captured his every twitch, every bead of sweat. James Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence filled the street the way command had filled briefing rooms half a world away. You said this card doesn't mean anything, James said, holding up his veteran's ID for all to see. His hand was steady, the stars catching the light. But this card represents 35 years of service. It represents leading soldiers into battles where we didn't all come home. It represents decisions I made with lives in the balance. Decisions you couldn't begin to imagine. The murmurs grew louder. A man in the crowd called out, "Tell him, General!" Others nodded, their respect shifting fully to James. Walter stammered, his swagger gone. I didn't know." James's gaze sharpened. "You didn't care to know. That's worse. You mocked service you've never given, and you tried to belittle a man you knew nothing about. Do you know what those 3 stars mean?" Walters opened his mouth, but no words came. "They mean," James continued, his tone like steel, "that while you were here writing parking tickets, I was responsible for thousands of men and women, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, soldiers who trusted me with their lives. I bore the weight of entire missions across continents, and I carried their memory home." The silence was absolute now, broken only by the whir of phone cameras. Walters shifted, suddenly small in his own uniform. James stepped closer, not menacing, but towering. "You wear a badge, officer. I respect the law, but respect must be earned. And today, you've shown this town that you don't deserve the power you abuse." The crowd erupted, clapping, cheering, voices rising like a tide. Walters shrank back, his authority unraveling under the weight of truth. For the first time since the stop began, the balance of power had shifted. No, more than that. The tables had turned completely. Colonel James Carter wasn't just another driver. He wasn't just a veteran. He was a man who outranked arrogance itself. And the whole town had just witnessed it. The crowd was buzzing now, a current of outrage and admiration that refused to be hushed. Dozens of phones were pointed at the scene, live streams already spreading beyond the quiet town of Maplewood. Officer Walters shifted uneasily, realizing every word he had mocked was now evidence against him. The tension broke with the sound of sirens. 2 more squad cars pulled up, their doors opening as the shift commander and another officer stepped out. The commander, a grizzled man with a clipped voice, strode forward. "Report, Walters." "What's going on here?" Walters stammered, gesturing vaguely toward James. This man. I stopped him for suspicious behavior, and he... Before he could finish, James calmly extended the leather case. The commander's eyes dropped to the insignia, and his entire posture shifted. He straightened, clicked his heels almost unconsciously, and gave a short, respectful nod. "Lieutenant General Carter," he said, voice steady, but tinged with awe. "Sir." Gasps rippled through the crowd again. The words hung heavy, undeniable. "Sir." Walters paled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Wait, he's really..." The commander turned, his gaze icy. "He's who you disrespected. And from what I've just heard, you've disgraced this department." The crowd erupted in agreement. Voices shouted, "He laughed at him. He mocked his ID. We saw it all." Neighbors stepped forward, testifying on the spot. The woman with the dog pointed at Walters. He treated him like a criminal for nothing. We all saw it. The teenager waved his phone. It's on video. Everything. The commander's jaw tightened. He turned back to Walters. Badge. Now Walters froze. What? You can't. Badge, the commander barked. His voice carried the weight of authority that Walters could never fake. Slowly, humiliated, Walters unpinned the metal shield from his chest and placed it in his superior's hand. James watched silently, his face unreadable. He hadn't asked for vengeance, but he knew accountability when he saw it. The commander faced him again, his voice quieter. General Carter, on behalf of this department, I apologize for the disrespect you've been shown. Thank you for your service. This town owes you more than it can repay. The crowd clapped, some cheering, others calling James a hero. Walters stood to the side, small and silent, stripped not just of his badge, but of the arrogance that once seemed welded to his skin. James inclined his head slightly, his voice calm. Apology accepted. What matters now is what you do next, not just to me, but to every person who looks like me and gets treated the same. The commander nodded solemnly. Understood, sir. And in that moment, accountability wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system being forced, by dignity, by truth, and by stars, to face itself. The next morning, Main Street buzzed with talk of only one thing. Everyone had seen the videos, shared them, replayed the moment when Officer Walters' smirk vanished at the sight of 3 stars. By dawn, news outlets had picked it up. The story of a small-town stop turned lesson in respect. But for Colonel James Carter, it wasn't about headlines. He rose early, as he always did, his routine unchanged. Coffee, a short walk, discipline that had shaped his life for decades. By mid-morning, he found himself at the town's Veterans Memorial, a modest granite wall etched with names. Families were already there, children with flags, teachers guiding field trips, elderly men and women in faded uniforms. When they saw him, whispers turned into applause. A little boy saluted with clumsy precision. His mother nudged him forward. "This is the man I told you about," she said softly. James bent slightly, returning the salute with crisp perfection. The boy's eyes widened, his grin stretching ear to ear. Around them, cameras flashed, but James didn't pose. He was simply present, steady, the same as he had always been. A group of veterans approached, some leaning on canes, others wearing caps embroidered with old unit insignias. One clasped James's hand firmly. "You stood tall yesterday," the man said, "not just for yourself. For all of us," James nodded, the weight of their words settling deep. "Respect isn't given freely," he said quietly. "Sometimes it has to be earned twice, once in service and again at home. Yesterday wasn't about me. It was about reminding this town who we are and what we've done." Behind him, the river glimmered, the same water where the night before his dignity had been tested. Now it reflected something different: unity. As the crowd lingered, James stepped back, letting the families, children, and fellow veterans take the space. His role had never been to bask in glory. It was to lead, to remind, to set an example. Somewhere across town, Walter sat in silence, his arrogance stripped away, his name now a cautionary tale. But James gave him no thought. That battle was already won. Instead, he placed a hand on the memorial's cold stone, whispering a promise to the names engraved there. "You're not forgotten." Not while I still stand. The town had learned a lesson it would not soon forget. Racism had tried to laugh him off the street, but respect, earned through sacrifice, through stars, through steadfastness, had the final word. And as James walked away, the children's voices carried after him, chanting softly like a chorus, "General Carter, General Carter." For the first time in a long while, the town felt different. Not perfect, but better, because dignity had prevailed.